when Silent Hill broke reality. There's a moment in Silent Hill 2 where James Sunderland stands before a filthy mirror in the Blue Creek apartments. His reflection stares back at him through layers of grime and decay. For years, players swore his reflection looked directly at them through the screen, past James, breaking that invisible wall between fiction and reality. The game's art director, Masahiro Ito, later dismissed this as headcanon, a trick of brightened images and desperate pattern recognition. But the debate itself reveals something profound about Silent Hill. Whether or not that mirror scene was intentional, the series had already done something far more disturbing than breaking the fourth wall. It broke reality itself, not just within its fiction, but the very concept of what reality means in a horror game. Silent Hill didn't just blur the line between the real and the imagined, it questioned whether that line existed at all. It created worlds where perception became reality, where guilt manifested as architecture, where the town itself was less a place than a psychological state wearing geography like a skin. This wasn't innovation for innovation's sake. This was Team Silent realizing that the most terrifying thing they could do wasn't show you monsters. It was make you uncertain whether anything you were experiencing could be trusted. Every horror game before Silent Hill had operated on a fundamental assumption. There is a reality, and scary things happen in it. Zombies in the mansion, creatures in the dark, ghosts in the school. These threats might be supernatural, but they're objectively real within the game's universe. Other characters see them. They leave physical evidence. They operate according to rules, even if those rules include resurrection and teleportation. Silent Hill said, what if none of that is true? What if the horror is that you cannot determine what's real? What if the entire experience is subjective, filtered through a broken mind, and you're playing not as someone exploring a haunted town, but as someone trapped inside their own deteriorating psyche, while the game refuses to tell you which parts are happening and which parts are hallucination? This was revolutionary in 1999 and remains uncomfortable now. Most horror media respects the viewer's grip on reality even as it shows impossible things. We see the shark in Jaws, see the xenomorph in Alien, see Freddy Krueger operate. We know what's real within the story's logic. Silent Hill ripped away that certainty. It gave us protagonists who couldn't be trusted, towns that shifted based on who was looking, and monsters that might be manifestations of guilt rather than physical creatures, meaning they're real to the person seeing them, but not necessarily to anyone else, not in any objective sense. The games never fully resolved this ambiguity. Even in moments of seeming clarity, Silent Hill maintained unsettling possibilities. When Eddie asks, did I go nuts? You gonna tell everybody I went nuts? Or when Vincent asks Heather, they look like monsters to you? The series reveals its hand. It's entirely possible that every monster, every otherworld shift, every rust-covered nightmare is purely internal. The game could be the story of mentally ill people wandering through an empty town, seeing horror that exists nowhere but in their damaged minds. And if you dismiss that interpretation, the game asks, are you sure? How do you know? This uncertainty, this fundamental questioning of what's happening on screen, created a horror that transcended jump scares and gore. It created existential dread, the nauseating feeling that you cannot trust your own perceptions, that the very nature of your reality might be compromised. Once that seed is planted, it doesn't go away. Even after you finish the game, the question lingers. What did I actually experience? What was objectively happening versus what was James's delusion? And if I can't determine that boundary in Silent Hill, how confident am I about reality in general? This is what we mean when we say Silent Hill broke reality. not through fourth wall breaks or self aware jokes, but through a sustained, deliberate, and deeply unsettling demolition of the assumptions that make horror games, and perhaps all games, function. Let's explore every facet of this reality breaking philosophy, from the unreliable narrators to the otherworld mechanics, to the time loop theories that suggest characters are trapped in recursive nightmares for decades. Let's understand how Silent Hill weaponized uncertainty, making it the true monster lurking in the fog. The unreliable narrator. When you can't trust yourself, James Sunderland tells us he received a letter from his dead wife Mary, summoning him to Silent Hill. He tells us she died 3 years ago from a terminal illness. He tells us he's looking for her because maybe, impossibly, she's alive and waiting at their special place. We believe him because he's the protagonist, our lens into this world. Game protagonists don't typically lie to players. They might withhold information for narrative purposes. They might discover things alongside us, but direct deception, that was rare in 2001, especially in a horror game. Horror games needed you to trust what you were seeing, to accept the reality being presented so the scares could land. Silent Hill 2 understood something twisted. The betrayal of that trust is its own kind of horror. James isn't just an unreliable narrator in the literary sense where we discover he's biased or mistaken. He's a liar to us, to other characters, and most disturbingly, to himself. His entire journey is built on a foundation of self deception so complete that he's rewritten his own history. Mary didn't die 3 years ago. She died days ago. She didn't die from an illness, not entirely. James killed her, smothered her with a pillow in a moment that was simultaneously mercy killing and murder, motivated by exhaustion and resentment as much as love and compassion. Everything James told us at the beginning was false. The letter he shows us eventually disappears, fading from his inventory as the game progresses, suggesting it never existed, or exists only in his desperate imagination, a lifeline he's created to justify his presence in Silent Hill while avoiding the truth of what he's done. This revelation recontextualizes everything. Every monster James fights might be a projection of his guilt. Pyramid Head, that iconic executioner dragging his great knife through hallways, could be James's own self-punishment made manifest. The lying figures, those writhing flesh bags choking on their own bodies, could represent Mary's suffering or James's perception of her illness. The mannequins might represent his sexual frustration during Mary's sickness. None of these creatures need to be real in any objective sense. They could all be James's fractured psyche creating physical forms for his emotional anguish, his guilt, his self-loathing. Silent Hill, the town, the phenomenon, takes these internal horrors and makes them concrete. Or it doesn't. Maybe James is simply insane, wandering an empty town attacking nothing while convinced he's fighting demons. Maybe Silent Hill is completely normal and James is just a murderer in the grips of a psychotic break. The game never definitively answers this. It gives us evidence for both interpretations. We see other characters in Silent Hill, which suggests it's not purely James's hallucination, but those other characters, Angela, Eddie, Laura, see different things. Angela sees fire everywhere. Eddie sees people mocking him. Laura sees a normal town. Each character's Silent Hill is personal, shaped by their trauma, their guilt, their mental state. This suggests the town operates on subjective reality, that multiple conflicting perceptions can exist simultaneously, each true for the person experiencing it. This is deeply uncomfortable from a gameplay perspective. In Resident Evil, we trust what we see because the game establishes a consistent reality. The tyrant is real. Multiple characters encounter it. The zombies leave corpses, the mechanisms of infection are explained, even the bizarre elements, the mansion's elaborate puzzles, the convenient placement of ammunition can be accepted as video game abstractions, but they're abstractions of a reality that exists. Silent Hill removes that certainty. When James fights monsters, are we watching combat or watching a man flailing at nothing? When he solves puzzles, are these actually complex mechanisms built into Silent Hill's architecture? Or is James's damaged mind imposing order on random environments, seeing connections that aren't there? The game doesn't tell us. It can't tell us because the entire point is that reality in Silent Hill is subjective to the point of being meaningless. There is no objective truth about what's happening, only James's experience of what's happening, and James's perceptions are compromised beyond repair. Other Silent Hill games employ similar unreliability. Harry Mason in the first game might be experiencing Alessa's nightmares rather than objective reality. Heather Mason in Silent Hill 3 carries memories and trauma that aren't biologically hers since she's a reincarnation, which means her perceptions are pre-corrupted by experiences she never actually had. Silent Hill Shattered Memories takes this to its logical conclusion, revealing that the entire game is a dying woman's therapy session, that Harry Mason's search for Cheryl is entirely imagined, that nothing we've been playing is happening except inside a mind trying to process trauma and death. The revelation that we've been playing as a dead man this whole time, that every choice we made was actually Cheryl's psychological projection, that the game was never about what we thought it was about. This shatters the assumption that games have reliable narration. The protagonist can be wrong. The protagonist can be lying. The protagonist can be dead and not know it. The protagonist can be entirely fictional, even within the fiction. And if that's true, what else can't we trust? This technique creates a horror that persists beyond the game itself. When you close Silent Hill 2, you're left with questions that have no answers. Was Maria real? She died multiple times and came back. Is she a ghost, a manifestation, a creation of James's mind, or something else entirely? What about Laura, the child who seems immune to Silent Hill's horrors, who sees none of the monsters, who never witnesses the otherworld shifts? Is she real and therefore proof that James's monsters are purely subjective? Or is she herself unreal, another manifestation perhaps representing the child James and Mary never had? The game provides evidence for multiple interpretations and refuses to crown any of them as correct. This ambiguity is intentional and crucial. The moment the game says, "Here's what really happened," the horror diminishes. The moment we can trust something, we have solid ground under our feet again. Silent Hill doesn't want us to have solid ground. It wants us falling forever, grasping at interpretations that might be true but can never be confirmed. This is what makes James such an effective, unreliable narrator. He's not lying to deceive us, he's lying because he can't face the truth. His unreliability is psychological, driven by self-preservation, by a mind that has rewritten history because the actual history is unbearable. And we, playing as James, participate in his delusion until the game forces us to confront what we've been ignoring. Every time we directed James to say he was looking for his wife, we were speaking his lies. Every time we fought monsters that might not exist, we were enacting his breakdown. The game doesn't separate player from protagonist. It implicates us in James's self-deception, making us complicit in his unreliability because we controlled him. We made his choices, we believed his story, because it was easier than questioning whether the person we're playing as can be trusted. The Otherworld. When architecture becomes psychology, the Otherworld is Silent Hill's most visceral, reality-breaking mechanism. It's the series' signature element, that moment when the fog shrouded streets or institutional corridors transform into rust, blood, and industrial nightmare. In the first game, a siren announces the shift. The world darkens, decays, becomes hostile. What was unsettling becomes overtly dangerous. But the other world isn't just an aesthetic choice or a way to raise stakes. It's a visualization of trauma made architectural, of internal horror externalized as environment. It's the game saying, this is what the inside of a damaged psyche looks like, and now you're going to walk through it. The first Silent Hill established that the other world was Alessa Gillespie's nightmare. She's the burned child kept barely alive by the cult, her psychic powers manifesting her anguish as a pocket dimension that overwrites reality. The town transforms because Alessa's pain is so intense it reshapes the world around her. This works as horror logic, supernatural powers creating a hell dimension. But even here, the game introduces ambiguity. A doctor's journal refers to the other world as existing on the border where reality and unreality intersect. It's described as both close and distant, suggesting it's not entirely separate from the normal world, but also not entirely part of it. Is it another dimension? A mass hallucination? A spiritual realm? The game offers multiple frameworks and commits to none. Silent Hill 2 revolutionized the Otherworld by making it personal. James's Otherworld is distinct from Alessa's. Where hers was fire and bleeding school corridors, his is industrial decay, flooded basements, and specifically personal symbols. The monsters are his, shaped by his specific guilt and frustrations. The environments reflect his psychological landscape. Hospitals remind him of Mary's illness. The prison represents his sense of being trapped. The hotel holds their shared memories now corrupted. When James is in the other world, he's literally inside his own mind. The rust and decay aren't just atmospheric, they're visual representations of his deteriorating mental state, his relationships corroding from the inside, his memories rotting. This personalization created a problem and an opportunity. If each character sees their own other world, then multiple characters in the same location would experience completely different realities. Angela's encounter in the abstract daddy's room shows her other world, a grotesque meat chamber with a piston-driven monster representing her sexual abuse. James sees this because he enters her nightmare briefly, or perhaps Angela's trauma is so intense it bleeds into James's perception. Either way, when James leaves that room and later encounters Angela on the burning staircase, she's in her personal hell. Everything is on fire, walls and stairs consumed by flames James cannot see. He's in his cold, watery other world. She's in her burning other world. They're in the same physical space, experiencing entirely different realities. Angela's line, "You see it too? For me, it's always like this," is devastating. She's lived in constant psychological anguish that now has physical form, and she assumes James sees the same fire she does. When he doesn't, the gulf between them is absolute. They cannot truly communicate because they exist in separate reality tunnels, each shaped by their individual trauma. This means there is no objective Silent Hill. There's no real version of the town that everyone experiences the same way. Instead, Silent Hill is a phenomenon that adapts to whoever enters it, creating personalized horror shows calibrated to each victim's psychology. Laura sees a normal, if empty, town because she has no guilt or trauma. Eddie sees mockery and judgment everywhere because of his paranoia and history of bullying. Angela sees fire and walls covered in meat because of her sexual trauma and self destruction. James sees water and rust and punishment because of what he did to Mary. None of these are the true Silent Hill. They're all true simultaneously, depending on who's looking. This breaks reality in a fundamental way. Most horror media, even psychological horror, maintains an objective baseline reality. In Jacob's Ladder, the protagonist hallucinates, but there's a truth beneath the hallucinations. In The Shining, Jack Torrance loses his mind, but the Overlook Hotel exists as a real place with a real history. Silent Hill doesn't give us that certainty. The other world might be a supernatural phenomenon that reshapes actual physical space according to the viewer's psyche. Or it might be purely mental, a shared hallucination, and the rust and blood and monsters exist only in the minds of the afflicted, while the real town remains unchanged. The games provide no way to determine which is true. Both explanations fit the evidence. Both are equally valid and equally terrifying. The mechanics of otherworld transitions add to this unreality. Sometimes a siren announces the shift, giving warning. Sometimes you walk through a door and the world has simply changed. Sometimes the environment decays in real time around you, walls rusting and bleeding as you watch. The unpredictability is deliberate. If the shifts followed consistent rules, players could anticipate and prepare. But the other world operates on dream logic, or nightmare logic. It happens when it happens, triggered by psychological states rather than physical laws. This removes player agency in unsettling ways. You cannot prevent the shift. You cannot control when you'll be thrust into the hostile nightmare space. The game decides, based on invisible internal triggers tied to the protagonist's mental state, when reality will collapse into something worse. Later games experimented with the otherworld concept. Silent Hill. Origins let players trigger the shift manually using mirrors, which gave control back to the player, but diminished the horror. If you can choose to enter and leave the otherworld at will, it feels less like an inescapable nightmare and more like a gameplay mechanic. Silent Hill 4. The room brought the other world into the protagonist's apartment, his supposed safe space, making nowhere safe. Silent Hill. Shattered memories used ice instead of rust, and the otherworld chase sequences became a different kind of horror, running through a world that's actively freezing and changing around you, pursued by creatures that can't be fought, only escaped. The visual design of the otherworld is crucial to understanding how it breaks reality. The first game drew inspiration from the works of Francis Bacon and Joel Peter Witkin, artists who depicted flesh and decay and biological horror. The otherworld in Silent Hill is organic and industrial simultaneously, suggesting bodies and factories merged, humans reduced to meat processed by uncaring machinery. Fleshy walls pulse, grated floors reveal abysses. Chains and barbed wire and rusted metal create an environment that's actively hostile, where every surface seems designed to hurt you. This aesthetic communicates that you're inside something alive and malicious, or inside something dead and decaying. The ambiguity is intentional. Is the otherworld a place, or is it a state of being? Is the rust symbolic or literal? When walls bleed, is that actual blood, or is that James's or Heather's or Angela's perception of surfaces that in reality are just concrete? The series never fully explains the other world's nature, and that's why it remains effective. The moment we understand it completely, it becomes just another horror setting. The power lies in the uncertainty, in never knowing whether the other world is a supernatural dimension, a psychological projection made real by Silent Hill's power, or purely a hallucination that exists only in broken minds. All three explanations are valid. All three are terrifying, and the games refuse to commit to any single interpretation, leaving players suspended in that ambiguity. unable to determine what's real within the fiction, much less what it means. The time loop theory, trapped in recursive nightmares. For years, Silent Hill 2 players noticed something disturbing. Bodies scattered throughout the game dressed exactly like James. Same green jacket, same build, same blonde hair. These corpses appear in impossible places, hanging from ceilings, slumped in corners, lying in locations James has never been. The obvious interpretation: these are James's deaths from previous attempts. The disturbing interpretation: James has been through this before, multiple times, trapped in a loop of punishment where he enters Silent Hill, experiences his guilt-laden journey, reaches some conclusion, and then resets to begin again. The truly horrifying interpretation: James has been stuck in this loop not for hours or days, but for decades, dying and resetting and dying again, endlessly reliving his punishment without ever escaping or learning. This is the time loop theory, and while it was speculation for years, the Silent Hill 2 remake released in 2024 added evidence that essentially confirms it. The remake introduces glimpses of the past, collectibles showing puzzles and locations from the 2001 original game. James comments on these with deja vu, suggesting he remembers previous loops. More damning is the strange photos collectible puzzle. Players discovered that counting objects in these photos, windows, birds, items, and mapping those numbers to letters in associated notes spells out, "You've been here for 2 decades." This is not subtle. The remake's creative director, Mateus Lenart, acknowledged the solution, essentially confirming that yes, James has been trapped in Silent Hill since the original game's release in 2001, experiencing loop after loop after loop for 20 years of real-world time. Inside the game's fiction, James's subjective experience could be even longer. The implications are psychologically devastating. The in-game narrative of Silent Hill 2 takes place over roughly a day. James arrives, explores the town, delves deeper into his repressed memories, confronts what he's done, and reaches one of several endings. But if the time loop theory is correct, this single day has repeated hundreds or thousands of times. James has walked these streets before. He's fought these monsters before. He's solved these puzzles before. He's had revelations about Mary's death before. And then something, Silent Hill itself, or James's inability to genuinely accept his guilt, or the narrative requirements of the game being played again, resets him to the beginning with his memories mostly wiped, leaving only faint traces of deja vu, vague unease, a sense that something about all of this is familiar, but he can't articulate why. This transforms Silent Hill 2 from a story about a man confronting his guilt into a story about a man incapable of ever truly confronting his guilt. Each loop, he gets close. Each loop, he faces the truth. Each loop, he reaches some ending, drowning himself in the lake, leaving the town with Laura, attempting to resurrect Mary, or whatever joke ending the game allows. But none of these endings are real or permanent. They all reset. James never escapes. He's been sentenced to relive his worst moments forever, and the cruel irony is that he barely remembers the previous iterations. The punishment isn't repetition with full awareness. That would at least have the mercy of knowledge. The punishment is repetition while convinced each time is the first time, that this journey is novel, that he's genuinely discovering these truths for the first time. It's Sisyphus pushing the boulder while having his memory wiped each time it rolls down, condemned to feel the shock and despair of failure anew forever. Evidence for the time loop theory exists even in the original game. Beyond the corpses, there's the famous mirror scene. Whether or not James' reflection breaks the fourth wall, The mirror is filthy and distorted, making clear self-recognition difficult. Later, in the Lakeview Hotel, room 312 contains the videotape showing Mary's death. James watches it and remembers what he's repressed. But how many times has he watched this tape? How many times has he remembered? The television static, the degradation of the tape, could these represent not just age but repeated viewings across multiple loops? When James says, "I was weak, that's why I needed you," is he speaking from this loop's revelation, or is he unknowingly echoing statements he's made dozens of times before? The monsters support this interpretation. Pyramid Head only appears when James needs punishment. During the final encounter, two Pyramid Heads kill themselves because James has finally accepted his guilt. Their purpose is fulfilled. But if James has been through this before, then Pyramid Head has fulfilled his purpose before, killed himself before, and yet returned in the next loop because James's acceptance was incomplete or forgotten. The monsters aren't just manifestations of guilt, they're recurring nightmares, the same traumas playing out again and again because the core wound never heals, only scabs over before being torn open in the next iteration. Silent Hill 4. The room adds meta-evidence. Frank Sunderland, James's father, mentions his son and daughter-in-law disappeared in Silent Hill years ago. They never came back. Their fate is unknown. This could be the Leave ending, where James drives away with Laura and vanishes from Frank's life. Or it could be evidence that James never left Silent Hill at all, that he's been there the entire time, trapped in loops while the outside world moves on. Frank doesn't seem to know his son is dead or missing, just that he disappeared, which tracks with the idea that James is spatially and temporally stuck in Silent Hill, existing in a pocket of repeating time, while linear time continues normally outside the town. PT, the playable teaser for the canceled Silent Hills, engaged with loop theory explicitly. The player walks a hallway that loops back on itself, experiencing the same space repeatedly, with subtle changes each iteration. Radio broadcasts reference families murdered by fathers in identical ways, suggesting either copycat killings or the same event occurring multiple times in different realities. The talking bloodied bag asks, "Are you sure the only you is you?" directly addressing the possibility of multiple parallel versions of the protagonist. The entire teaser is structured around recursion and repetition, with the solution to puzzles requiring actions in previous loops that affect future loops. PT was never Silent Hill 2, but its obsession with loops and alternate realities suggests where the series was heading, toward explicit engagement with the metatextual horror of characters trapped in recursive narratives. The time loop theory breaks reality by questioning the finality of narrative. In most games, even those with multiple endings, we assume that when we finish the game and see credits roll, we've reached an ending. It might not be the true ending, but it's an ending. The character's journey concludes, for better or worse. The time loop theory says, no, it doesn't conclude. The ending is false. The credits are a lie. The moment the game ends, it begins again. James walks into Silent Hill again. The loop continues. From the player's perspective, we can stop playing, but James cannot stop experiencing. We close the game. He opens it. Our control over him is temporary and cyclical, a brief possession during one iteration of his eternal punishment. When we're not playing, what happens to James? Is he frozen, paused between loops? Or does the loop continue without player input, with James stumbling through his personal hell in darkness while waiting for a player to take control again? This creates an uncomfortable relationship between player and character. We're not saving James. We're participating in his torture. Every playthrough is another loop, Another iteration where James briefly hopes he'll find Mary and escape, only to discover the same truths and reach the same non-final endings. Our replay of the game isn't a mechanical repeat of content. It's diegetic, part of James's experience. When we start a new game plus, we're not just playing again for different endings or collectibles. We're forcing James to go through it again. We're complicit in his loop. We are, in a sense, Silent Hill itself, the force that drags him back to the beginning. The remake's "You've Been Here for 2 decades" message creates a weird meta-horror by tying James's loops to real-world time. The original game released in September 2001. The remake released in October 2024, roughly 23 years later. If James has been looping since the original release, his subjective experience across all those iterations would be incomprehensible. Even if each loop takes only 1 day of his perceived time, that's over 8,000 days, over 22 years of constantly reliving the same trauma. More likely, each loop takes longer, with James spending perceived weeks or months in Silent Hill's fog and nightmare spaces, which would multiply his suffering exponentially. The man who enters Silent Hill at the remake's beginning has endured decades of punishment, and he doesn't even know it. The traces of memory, the deja vu, the glimpses of the past, are his subconscious trying to break through the loop's amnesia, trying to warn him that he's done this before, but the warnings never translate into actual prevention. He's stuck. The time loop theory also explains the multiple endings, mechanically and narratively. In most games, multiple endings are non-canonical alternatives the player chooses. Silent Hill 2's endings are determined by subtle actions throughout the game: examining Mary's photo, listening to her letter, health management, how much time is spent with Maria. The game tracks these actions invisibly and uses them to determine which ending James receives. If every ending is part of the loop, then all endings are canonical. James has drowned himself in the lake. James has left town with Laura. James has tried to resurrect Mary. James has driven off with Maria. James has died in the dog ending, where a Shiba Inu controlled everything. All of these happened in different loops, and none of them stuck. Each ending resets the loop, some more obviously than others. The in-water ending, suicide, seems final but just restarts the loop with James alive again. The leave ending seems like escape, but Silent Hill 4's reference suggests James never truly left. The rebirth ending is explicitly an attempt to break the loop by resurrecting Mary, but there's no evidence it works. The loops continue. This is horror that exists outside traditional narrative structure. It's not about jump scares or gore or even tragic character arcs. It's about the existential nightmare of being trapped in a repeating narrative with no true escape, where every conclusion is temporary and every revelation is forgotten. It's about characters who exist to suffer and cannot stop existing, and it's made worse by the fact that James probably deserves this. He's a murderer, after all, even if it was mercy killing. Silent Hill's punishment fits the crime. He took Mary's life, and now he's trapped in death and life, existing but not living, experiencing but not progressing, punished but never absolved. The loops ensure his guilt is perpetual, his suffering endless, his punishment proportional to a crime that can never be undone. The subjective reality, they look like monsters to you? Vincent's line in Silent Hill 3 is delivered almost as a throwaway, but it carries massive implications. They look like monsters to you? He's speaking to Heather Mason after she's fought through otherworld horrors and cultists. The line suggests that what Heather sees as monsters might look different to Vincent, or might not look like anything at all. It's a moment of profound uncertainty where the game directly questions whether the monsters are objectively real or perceptually subjective. If Vincent sees something different than Heather, then there's no definitive reality, just multiple valid perceptions that contradict each other. This concept, that Silent Hill's horrors are visible only to those who perceive them, runs through the series but is rarely stated so explicitly. It's implied by Laura never seeing monsters in Silent Hill 2. She walks through the same streets as James, enters the same buildings, exists in the same town, but she experiences none of the horror. She doesn't see lying figures or mannequins or Pyramid Head. She doesn't witness otherworld transitions. To her, Silent Hill is a normal, if empty and kinda creepy, town. This could be explained by Laura's innocence. She has no guilt or trauma, so Silent Hill has no hooks into her psyche. But it also suggests that the monsters are not objectively present. They're not physical entities that happen to ignore Laura. They literally don't exist for her because her perception doesn't create them. James sees monsters because James's mind manufactures monsters. Laura doesn't, so she doesn't see them. Same space, different realities. This introduces the disturbing possibility that all Silent Hill monsters are hallucinations. Not hallucinations in the sense of not real within the game's fiction, but hallucinations in the sense of existing only in the minds of those who see them. When James swings a pipe at a lying figure, he perceives hitting a monster. But what's objectively happening? Is he hitting an actual creature that exists in physical space? Or is he hitting nothing, swinging at empty air while his mind projects a monster into that space? Or, most disturbingly, is he hitting a person, a real human being that his broken mind has transformed into something monstrous to justify violence against it? Eddie's breakdown suggests the latter interpretation. Eddie kills people. We know this because he talks about it, because he's fleeing consequences when we meet him. When Eddie fights James, Eddie accuses James of mocking him, of being just like everyone who bullied him. But Eddie's paranoia is established. He sees mockery where none exists. When Eddie looks at James, does he see James as he is? Or has Eddie's paranoia transformed James into one of his tormentors? When Eddie dies, James is standing over a corpse. Is it Eddie's corpse? Or has Eddie been a normal person this whole time, and James just killed someone? The game never shows Eddie transform into a monster, but the ambiguity is there. How much of what we see is shared reality, and how much is one character's perception leaking into our player perspective? Angela's burning staircase scene crystallizes this. She's in fire, surrounded by flames, ascending stairs that are themselves ablaze. James doesn't see fire. His Silent Hill is cold and wet, but Angela sees fire always, has seen fire always. Her trauma from childhood sexual abuse manifests as burning, as consuming flame that never goes out. This is her otherworld, overlapping with James's otherworld but not replacing it. They exist in the same location, experiencing entirely different environmental realities. When James says, "Is it hot in here?" and Angela responds, "You see it too? For me, it's always like this." She's revealing that her perception of Silent Hill is fire and heat all the time, overlaid on everything. James sees a fraction of her experience, feels some of her heat, but he's still in his own other world, which is why the fire doesn't consume him. If he fully experienced Angela's Silent Hill, he'd burn alive. Instead, their perceptions briefly overlap, allowing James to feel her suffering without fully entering it. This suggests that Silent Hill is not a single space, but a collection of overlapping personal hells, each shaped by the individual experiencing it. The town has the power, through supernatural means or psychological influence, to create customized horror for each victim. It reads their trauma, guilt, fears, and constructs a nightmare precisely calibrated to their psyche. Multiple people can be in Silent Hill simultaneously, occupying the same physical coordinates, but experiencing completely different realities. They can interact. James speaks with Angela, Eddie, Laura, but they can never fully share each other's experiences because each person's Silent Hill is private, internal, and incommunicable. This breaks reality in that it denies objective truth. In most horror, even when perception is unreliable, there's usually a ground truth. The Shining's ghost might be in Jack's head, but the Overlook Hotel is really there, really has that history. The paranormal events of Hereditary happen objectively within the film's universe. Silent Hill refuses this framework, and it presents a world where subjective perception is reality, where what actually happened is an unanswerable question because different characters experience different realities, all equally valid from their perspectives. James fought monsters. Laura walked through an empty town. Angela burned. Eddie was mocked. All of these are true simultaneously because truth in Silent Hill is subjective, personal, and non transferable. This has profound implications for players trying to understand the lore. Every time we try to establish what really happened in Silent Hill, we're imposing objectivity on a system that rejects it. The Otherworld doesn't have a definitive form, it has thousands of forms, one per visitor. The monsters aren't a catalog of creatures, they're personalized manifestations that look different and mean different things to different people. A nurse monster in Silent Hill 2 might represent sexual frustration and medical trauma for James, but if another character saw nurses, they'd see different nurses representing their specific relationship with medicine, hospitals, or authority figures. The creature design we see is James's version, and we have no way to know what Angela's monsters looked like, or Eddie's, because we never see through their eyes. Vincent's question becomes even more disturbing if we extend it beyond monsters to all of Silent Hill. They looked like monsters to you could apply to everything. The other world looked like rust and decay to you. The town looked abandoned to you. The fog was thick to you. Every element of Silent Hill's presentation could be subjective, visible only to those perceiving it, which means the player has no reliable access to objective reality. We only have James's perspective, and James is unreliable. We're playing a game that shows us a specific character's subjective experience while denying us any way to verify whether that experience corresponds to anything objectively real within the game's universe. This is why Vincent's question lingers. Once asked, it cannot be unasked. Every subsequent encounter with Silent Hill's horrors is now filtered through uncertainty. Are these monsters real? Are they hallucinations? Are they people? The game will not answer. It's designed not to answer because answering would reduce the horror. The power lies in not knowing, in being unable to determine the ontological status of what you're experiencing. This uncertainty makes every action morally ambiguous. When James kills a monster, is he defending himself from a genuine threat, or is he murdering an innocent person his mind has transformed into a threat to justify violence? We cannot know. He cannot know. And that uncertainty, the possibility that every act of self-defense might actually be murder, adds a layer of horror that persists long after the game is turned off. The meta narrative, breaking the fourth wall without breaking it. Silent Hill rarely breaks the fourth wall in obvious ways. There are no characters who acknowledge they're in a video game, no controller vibration jokes like Metal Gear Solid's Psycho Mantis fight, no direct addresses to the player. Yet the series is deeply metatextual. constantly referencing the artificial nature of the experience in ways that create discomfort without explicit fourth wall breaks. It weaponizes the medium's constraints and converts them into horror. The most famous potential fourth wall break is the mirror scene in Silent Hill 2, which we discussed earlier. Whether or not James's reflection actually looks at the player through the screen, the scene functions as a moment of uncomfortable eye contact. We're watching James look at himself, and for a brief moment, the visual composition creates ambiguity about who's looking at whom. The mirror is dirty, obscuring details, but the scene's blocking and camera angle suggest James, or something wearing James's face, might be aware of us. This is subtle enough to be deniable, which makes it more effective than an overt fourth wall break would be. The uncertainty is the point. Did that just happen? Did he look at us? The game never confirms or denies, leaving players unsure whether they experienced something uncanny or simply projected meaning onto ambiguous imagery. Silent Hill 3's toilet scene is more explicit but also played for comedy, which reduces its horror impact. When Heather approaches a toilet that obviously contains something disgusting, she stops and looks directly at the camera, asking, "Who would do something so disgusting?" The line references Silent Hill 2, where James reaches into a toilet to retrieve a wallet. Heather's look and comment break the fourth wall by addressing the player's memory of James's action, asking us why we made that choice. It's self-aware in a way that acknowledges the player's presence and past decisions, but it's also a joke, a moment of levity in an otherwise grim game. The tone undercuts any genuine meta-horror, turning the fourth wall break into an Easter egg rather than a disturbing commentary on player agency or the nature of playing horror games. PT engages with metatextual horror more aggressively. The entire teaser is about repetition and recursion, about walking the same hallway loop after loop while conditions change. This mirrors the player experience of playing horror games, repeating sections after death, replaying games to see different content, returning to familiar spaces that become unfamiliar through repetition. PT's puzzles require actions across multiple loops, meaning previous iterations affect future ones, which creates a sense that the game remembers what you've done even as the protagonist resets. When the bloodied bag talks about separate realities and asks, "Are you sure the only you is you?" It's addressing the player's relationship with the game itself. Every playthrough creates a different reality. Every player creates a different version of events. The only constant is the structure, the hallway, the rules, the inevitability of the loop. PT is metatextual without being explicit, creating discomfort about the nature of playing games without directly addressing the player. The psychological profiling in Silent Hill, Shattered Memories, is perhaps the most interesting meta element in the series. Throughout the game, players are periodically pulled out of gameplay into therapy sessions where psychiatrists ask personal questions about sex, relationships, family, school. The answers affect Harry's appearance, the monster's designs, how other characters behave, even which ending you receive. The game is analyzing you, the player, and shaping the experience based on your psychology. When the final revelation comes, that the entire game has been Cheryl's therapy, that Harry is dead, that everything we experience was one woman's psychological processing of trauma, the meta layer becomes clear. The game was never about Harry searching for Cheryl. It was about Cheryl searching for closure, using her father as a protagonist in her imagined narrative, and the player's answers to the therapy questions were shaping how Cheryl processed her grief. We weren't playing as Harry. We were playing as a dead man through a grieving woman's imagination, and our psychological profile determined what version of that fantasy we experienced. This is fourth wall breaking through structure rather than dialogue. The game never says, you, the player, are being analyzed, but that's exactly what's happening. The therapy sequences aren't just narrative framing, they're literal psychological tests administered to you, and your responses shape the game world. This creates an uncomfortable collapse between player and character. Harry's personality is determined by our answers, meaning Harry is partially us, partially Cheryl's memory of her father, partially a fictional construct. The boundaries blur. We control Harry, but Cheryl imagines Harry, but Harry is based on our psychological profile. Who is the real protagonist? Who is playing whom? The game refuses simple answers, creating a metatextual tangle where player, character, and in-game therapist are all observing and influencing each other. The multiple endings across the series also function as meta-commentary on player agency and determinism. In Silent Hill 2, the ending is determined by invisible tracking of player behavior throughout the game. You don't choose the ending through a dialogue tree or final decision. The game watches how you play. Do you examine Mary's photo and letter repeatedly, suggesting James still loves her? Do you take damage frequently, suggesting self-destructive tendencies? Do you spend time with Maria, suggesting James is replacing Mary rather than mourning her? The ending is calculated from these unconscious player behaviors, meaning the game is interpreting your playstyle as characterization. You thought you were just playing a horror game, but Silent Hill 2 was reading your playstyle as psychology, using your unconscious decisions to determine James's final mental state. This is metatextual horror. The game knows you better than you know yourself, or at least it claims to. It's watching you, judging you, and delivering consequences based on behaviors you weren't conscious of performing. The joke endings also serve a meta function. The dog ending, UFO endings, and other overtly ridiculous conclusions to Silent Hill games acknowledge that the player is playing a game, experiencing multiple playthroughs, and might want something absurd after several tragic endings. But these joke endings are also deeply weird when considered alongside the canonical endings. They exist in the same game, accessible through the same save file, treated as equally valid endings by the game's structure. In the dog ending, James discovers a Shiba Inu has been controlling all of Silent Hill's events. It's played for comedy, but it's also profoundly unsettling. It suggests that the entire narrative we experienced, all the psychological horror and guilt and punishment, was orchestrated by an outside force. The dog is a stand-in for the developers, for the player, for narrative agency itself. It's a joke ending, but it's also a meta-commentary. Someone did construct all of this, and it wasn't James or Silent Hill. It was Team Silent, and by extension, it was us choosing to play, choosing to put James through this. The dog is a mirror. We are the force controlling events, and from James's perspective, that force is incomprehensible and absurd. A cosmic joke with no meaning behind it except that someone found it entertaining. Even Silent Hill's use of save points has metatextual implications. Save points in most games are mechanical conveniences, non-diegetic elements that exist for player utility. In Silent Hill, save points are red notebooks or specific objects in the environment, and they're accompanied by that distinctive melancholic music. Saving becomes a ritual. You approach the save point, the music plays, you feel momentarily safe, but this safety is false. You're not safe from the narrative, only from losing progress. The save point acknowledges the artificiality of the experience. You're playing a game that can be saved and reloaded while also being diegetic. It's an object in the world. This dual nature creates a weird liminality where the game simultaneously insists on its reality and acknowledges its artificiality. You're immersed in James's journey, and also you're playing a video game that can be paused and resumed. Both are true, and the tension between them is never resolved. The series doesn't need explicit fourth wall breaks because its entire structure is about uncertainty, unreality, and the collapse of boundaries. The boundary between player and character is porous. The boundary between reality and hallucination is non existent. The boundary between mechanical game elements and diegetic story elements is deliberately blurred. Silent Hill creates horror by making everything feel slightly wrong, slightly artificial, slightly aware of itself without ever becoming overtly self aware. It's metatextual horror through implication and structure, not through overt acknowledgement. And this makes it more unsettling than games that do break the fourth wall directly, because Silent Hill's meta elements feel like intrusions from outside the game's reality rather than intentional comedy beats. The ontological horror. What even is Silent Hill? After exploring unreliable narrators, subjective realities, time loops, and meta narratives, we arrive at the fundamental question Silent Hill refuses to answer. What is Silent Hill? Not as a physical location, but as a phenomenon. What is the nature of the force that transforms a lakeside resort town into a personalized hell dimension? Multiple explanations exist across the series, and the games deliberately refuse to commit to any single interpretation. One explanation: Silent Hill is a supernatural place with inherent power, rooted in the town's history of cultism, witch burnings, and Native American sacred ground. The Order, the cult that burned Alessa, believes Silent Hill is special, that its location grants access to occult forces. This explanation positions Silent Hill as genuinely supernatural, a place where the boundaries between dimensions are thin, where ritual and belief can reshape reality. Alessa's immolation and subsequent psychic powers tapped into Silent Hill's latent abilities, triggering the otherworld phenomenon. Future visitors experience their own personal otherworlds because Alessa's transformation opened Silent Hill permanently, allowing its power to affect anyone who enters with sufficient trauma or guilt. Another explanation: Silent Hill is psychological. There's nothing supernatural about the town itself. It's a normal place where a tragedy happened, and people with mental illness or severe trauma who visit experience psychotic breaks. The monsters are hallucinations. The other world is a dissociative state. The personalized horrors are the mind's way of processing unbearable emotions. Under this interpretation, Alessa was a severely burned child with psychological powers, telepathy, perhaps, that caused others to experience her pain. But there's no alternate dimension. There's no cult successfully summoning demons. There's just traumatized people in a location associated with trauma, experiencing psychotic episodes that happen to share certain features because human psychology works in similar ways. James is insane, wandering an empty town attacking nothing. Angela set herself on fire or imagined burning. Eddie shot people he thought were mocking him. Their paths crossed because they were all drawn to the same place, but their experiences didn't literally reshape reality, they just felt like they did. A third explanation: Silent Hill is punishment. It's a form of purgatory, a place where guilty people are drawn and forced to face their sins. This explanation leans toward the spiritual without necessarily being religious. Silent Hill functions as cosmic justice, an automatic system that identifies sinners and traps them in personalized torments until they either accept their guilt and escape or reject it and remain trapped forever. Under this interpretation, the town has agency and intelligence, carefully constructing scenarios to maximize each victim's psychological suffering. It's not random, it's calculated, designed, purposeful. James sees Mary because that's precisely what will hurt him most. Angela sees fire because that's her worst nightmare. The town is sadistic but not malicious. It's corrective, attempting to force growth through suffering. A fourth explanation: Silent Hill doesn't exist. Not as a distinct phenomenon, anyway. The games are about mentally ill people, and Silent Hill is simply what we call the interior landscape of trauma and psychosis. There's no town with special powers. There are just broken people experiencing their minds collapse in ways that happen to share aesthetic similarities because the games are made by the same team using consistent visual language. James's story isn't connected to Alessa's story or Harry's story. They're separate narratives about separate people, connected only by shared themes of guilt and loss. This interpretation rejects any supernatural or shared elements, treating each game as an isolated psychological study. A fifth explanation: Silent Hill is metatextual. The town is the game itself, aware of its status as fiction, and the horror comes from characters being trapped in a video game. The loops aren't mystical punishment, they're new game plus playthroughs. The monsters aren't manifestations of guilt, they're designed enemies for the player to fight. The Otherworld isn't a supernatural dimension, it's different level geometry. Under this interpretation, Silent Hill is about the horror of being a video game character, aware enough to sense the artificiality of your existence but unable to escape it. James is trapped because he's code, existing only when the game is running, ceasing when it's turned off, resumed when players return. His suffering is eternal because the game can be played infinitely, and each playthrough is another instance of his torture. The genius, or the frustration depending on your perspective, is that Silent Hill provides evidence for all these interpretations and commits to none. Every explanation fits the available facts. Every theory has textual support, and the games will not tell you which is correct, because there is no correct answer. Or rather, all answers are correct simultaneously, depending on which aspect of the series you emphasize. This ontological ambiguity is fundamental to the series' identity. The moment Konami or Team Silent definitively explains what Silent Hill is and how it works, the series loses its power. The horror exists in the uncertainty, in the inability to definitively categorize the threat, in the suspicion that reality itself is compromised, but being unable to determine how or why. This creates a kind of horror that's rare in games. Most games eventually explain their core conceits. Resident Evil tells you about the virus, how it works, who created it. BioShock reveals Rapture's history and the nature of plasmids. Even Dark Souls, famously obtuse about its lore, provides enough fragments to piece together what happened and why. Silent Hill refuses this clarity. It's narratively agnostic about its own mechanics, presenting supernatural elements alongside psychological explanations, alongside metaphysical interpretations, and letting them all coexist without hierarchy. You, the player, must decide what you believe is happening, but the game will never confirm or deny your interpretation. You'll never know if you're right. This is ontological horror, the fear that the basic nature of reality is unknowable, not hidden, not mysterious, but fundamentally unknowable because there is no objective truth to discover. Silent Hill suggests that existence might be entirely subjective, that there might be no reality beneath perception, that what is real is whatever the individual experiences. and no amount of investigation or philosophy can determine whether shared reality exists at all. This is more disturbing than jump scares or gore because it attacks the foundation of how we understand the world. We assume there's a truth. We assume investigation reveals answers. Silent Hill says, maybe not. Maybe reality is whatever your damaged mind constructs, and there's no way to verify anything beyond your own perceptions, which you already know are compromised. You're trapped in your skull, experiencing a world that may or may not exist outside your mind, with no method to determine which. And if that's true for Silent Hill's characters, why isn't it true for us? The legacy. Reality broken. Permanently, Silent Hill broke reality in 1999, and video game horror has been dealing with the aftermath ever since. Every horror game that followed exists in Silent Hill's shadow, either learning from its innovations or deliberately avoiding them. The series' influence is incalculable, not just in horror games, but in how games approach unreliable narration, subjective perception, and the collapse of boundaries between player and character, fiction and reality. Amnesia. The Dark Descent learned from Silent Hill's vulnerability mechanics. Its protagonist cannot fight, only hide and flee. The sanity system creates perceptual distortions. The screen warps, sounds become unreliable, hallucinations appear. These are Silent Hill's reality-breaking techniques applied to different mythology. The idea that your perception of the game world can become unreliable, that you cannot trust what you see, comes directly from Silent Hill's playbook. Spec Ops. The line borrows Silent Hill's unreliable narrator structure. The protagonist, Captain Walker, experiences increasingly surreal events as the game progresses, and the final revelation that much of what we've experienced was hallucination or misremembered transforms everything that came before. The game uses this to critique military shooters and player complicity in violence, but the technique, protagonist lying to himself, and by extension to the player, is pure Silent Hill. Layers of Fear takes Silent Hill's psychological horror and applies it to a mansion that constantly reconfigures itself based on the protagonist's deteriorating mental state. Rooms change when you look away. Paintings alter. The environment reflects internal trauma. The game is essentially walking through a mind rather than a place, which is what Silent Hill did with the Otherworld but made explicit. Control by Remedy Entertainment explores the idea of a location, the oldest house, that operates on dream logic, where rooms connect impossibly, where you can walk down a hallway and emerge somewhere completely different. This is the Otherworld transition made into gameplay exploration. The Federal Bureau of Control studies objects of power and altered world events, which is basically acknowledging that Silent Hill-style reality breakdowns happen throughout their universe. The game leans into the weirdness, making it a feature rather than solely horror, but the DNA is clearly Silent Hill's influence. Even The Last of Us Part 2, not primarily a horror game, uses Ellie as an unreliable narrator whose perception of events is colored by trauma and rage. The game's structure, showing events from multiple perspectives, revealing information that recontextualizes earlier scenes, reflects Silent Hill's approach to narrative ambiguity. We trust Ellie's perspective because she's the protagonist, but the game gradually reveals that her perception has been warped by grief, making us question our own complicity in her actions. Fatal Frame learned from Silent Hill's vulnerability and implemented it through the camera obscura mechanic. Your only weapon is also your viewfinder, forcing you to look directly at ghosts to defeat them. This creates intimacy with horror, making you study the thing you're afraid of, which is thematically linked to Silent Hill's approach of forcing protagonists to confront their trauma face to face. Resident Evil 7 and Village adopted first person perspective and a stronger focus on psychological horror over action, clearly influenced by Silent Hill's emphasis on vulnerability and atmosphere. Village, in particular, plays with unreliable narration through Ethan's perspective, revealing information about his state that recontextualizes the entire experience. But Silent Hill's influence extends beyond specific horror games. The idea that game narratives can be deeply unreliable, that player perspective cannot be trusted, that the game can lie to you and make that lie part of the horror. This has spread throughout gaming. Metal Gear Solid 5 uses this with Venom Snake's identity. BioShock's Would You Kindly Twist works because games condition players to follow instructions without question. Undertale subverts player expectations about save scumming by making the game remember your previous playthroughs, treating resets as diegetic events that have consequences. NER Automata requires multiple playthroughs from different perspectives to understand the full story, revealing that earlier perspectives were incomplete or misleading. Silent Hill normalized the idea that games can be about more than mechanics and challenge. They can be psychological experiences that unsettle players not through difficulty, but through narrative structure and thematic content. The series demonstrated that horror in games doesn't require action or combat. Some of Silent Hill 2's most horrifying moments involve simply walking through empty rooms, the dread building from atmosphere and implication rather than direct threat. This lesson influenced countless games. That absence can be more frightening than presence, that what you don't show is often more effective than what you do, that player imagination is more powerful than any monster design. The time loop concept has proliferated. Outer Wilds uses it for exploration rather than horror. Deathloop makes it mechanical and fun. Returnal combines it with roguelike structure. 12 minutes creates a puzzle game out of escaping one. These aren't all horror games, but they're all engaging with the existential dread of repetition that Silent Hill codified. The idea that being trapped in a repeating narrative is itself a form of horror, regardless of what happens within that narrative. The subjective reality concept has influenced how games think about morality systems and branching narratives. If reality is subjective, then there's no objectively correct choice. Mass Effect's Paragon Yacht Renegade system, The Walking Dead's moral choices, Detroit Become Humans flowcharts, all of these implicitly accept Silent Hill's thesis that there's no single truth, only perspectives and consequences. Games became more comfortable with ambiguity, with refusing to tell players whether they made the right choice, because Silent Hill demonstrated that ambiguity can be more engaging than moral clarity. The meta-narrative techniques, the fourth wall adjacent discomfort, the acknowledgement that you're playing a game and someone constructed this experience for you. Silent Hill made this acceptable in horror. Before Silent Hill, meta elements were usually comedic, Earthbound, Metal Gear Solid, or puzzle-focused Eternal Darkness. Silent Hill showed that self-awareness could be horrifying if handled with the right tone, that acknowledging the artificiality of the experience doesn't break immersion if the acknowledgement is subtle and disturbing rather than winking and jokey. This opened doors for horror games to play with structure, to acknowledge their own limitations and constraints, to make the medium itself part of the horror rather than trying to hide it. But perhaps Silent Hill's most lasting impact is permission to refuse answers. Before Silent Hill, games felt obligated to explain their conceits. By the end, you knew how the magic worked, why the monsters existed, what was real and what wasn't. Silent Hill said, "No, we're not explaining. We're giving you fragments and contradictions, and you'll never know for certain what happened. This was radical. Players were trained to expect closure, to have mystery solved. Silent Hill denied them that satisfaction and demonstrated that denial could be more satisfying than resolution. The ambiguity became the point. The uncertainty became the horror. Contemporary horror games owe Silent Hill an enormous debt, but they also reveal what's been lost. Many games copy Silent Hill's aesthetics, the fog, the rust, the industrial decay, without understanding why those aesthetics worked. They create other worlds without making them personal or meaningful. They use unreliable narrators as a twist rather than a structural foundation. They break the fourth wall for shock value rather than to create genuine meta horror. The surface elements are easy to replicate. The depth is not. The Silent Hill series itself struggled with this. Team Silent's final game was Silent Hill 4, The Room, which experimented with the formula in ways that divided fans. After Team Silent disbanded, Western developers took over, and the results were mixed. Silent Hill, Origins, Homecoming, Downpour, and Shattered Memories each had interesting ideas, but none captured what made the original trilogy special. They understood the aesthetics, but not the philosophy. They could do fog and monsters, but they struggled with the ontological horror, the reality-breaking ambiguity, the commitment to uncertainty. Shattered Memories came closest by reinventing the formula entirely, but it's divisive precisely because it's so different from the originals. The 2024 Silent Hill 2 remake by Bloober Team faces a unique challenge. How do you remake a game whose power came partly from PlayStation 2 limitations? The original's fog was born from draw distance constraints. Its fixed camera angles created specific framing that enhanced dread. Its tank controls made combat clunky, emphasizing vulnerability. Modernizing these elements risks losing what made them effective. Early responses suggest Bloober Team understood the assignment, that they captured the atmosphere and psychological weight even while updating mechanics. But the remake also confirms the time loop theory explicitly, which is both fascinating and potentially diminishing. By answering a question the original left ambiguous, it provides closure that might reduce the horror of uncertainty. Silent Hill broke reality in 1999, and we're still picking up the pieces. The series demonstrated that horror games could be more than jump scares and resource management. They could be philosophical inquiries into the nature of perception, guilt, and existence. They could refuse easy answers and remain powerful because of that refusal. They could make players deeply uncomfortable not by showing them terrible things, but by making them uncertain about what they were seeing, whether it was real, whether they could trust their own judgment. This is a harder kind of horror to create, and a more lasting kind of horror to experience. It doesn't fade when you turn off the game. The uncertainty remains, a seed planted in your understanding of how reality works in games, and by extension, how it works in general. Because once you've experienced Silent Hill, once you've navigated its fog and rust and personalized nightmare spaces, once you've reached the end and realized you cannot determine what was real and what was hallucination, what was supernatural and what was psychological, what was punishment and what was sickness, once you've accepted that no amount of analysis will give you definitive answers, that the ambiguity is permanent, that the game will not save you from uncertainty, you carry that with you. Every subsequent horror game, every subsequent mystery, every situation where perception might be unreliable, you remember Silent Hill. You remember that reality can be subjective, that narrators cannot always be trusted, that the most terrifying thing isn't what's in the dark, but the possibility that the dark is all there is, that beneath our perceptions there might be nothing. that reality might not exist objectively at all. Silent Hill broke reality by revealing it was never whole to begin with. It showed us the cracks, the inconsistencies, the places where perception fails to align with truth, because there is no truth, only experience. And it did this in 1999 with limited hardware and a small team, creating something so conceptually disturbing that 2 decades later we're still trying to understand how they did it and why it worked so effectively. The fog hasn't lifted, the monsters haven't been explained, the questions haven't been answered, and that's exactly how it should be. Because the moment we understand Silent Hill completely, the moment we can categorize and explain and rationalize everything about it, the horror ends. As long as we remain uncertain, as long as we cannot pin down exactly what Silent Hill is and how it operates, and whether any of it is real, it retains its power to disturb. Reality is broken in Silent Hill. It was always broken. We just didn't notice until James Sunderland walked into the fog looking for a dead woman who sent him a letter that never existed, beginning a journey that might have happened or might have been delusion, might have lasted a day, or might have lasted 20 years, might have ended in escape or suicide or resurrection or eternal recursion. We don't know. We can't know. We'll never know. And that's the point. That's the horror. That's what Silent Hill did that nothing else has quite managed to replicate. It made not knowing worse than knowing, made uncertainty more frightening than any monster, made the absence of answers more disturbing than any revelation could be. The fog remains, the siren sounds, the world transforms, and we walk forward into streets that shift and decay around us, never certain whether what we're experiencing is real or imagined, punishment or sickness, supernatural or psychological game, or something that transcends the medium and reaches into us, changing our understanding of what reality means and whether it exists at all outside the fragile, fallible perceptions of broken minds trying desperately to make sense of a world that refuses to offer sense. Silent Hill broke reality, and reality has never been the same since.